Welcome, everyone. My name is Martin Jean. I'm director of the Institute of Sacred Music. We are an interdisciplinary graduate center at Yale University for the study and practice of sacred music, worship, and the related arts. This is the third part of our four-part webinar series called Accompanying the Dying and the Dead in the Time of COVID. As the world reels from incredible loss and near loss of life in these past 18 months, we want to open up a space here to learn what we can, to interrogate our practices around death and dying, and to work together toward a way forward as our world emerges from this dark time. Today, we want to ask what we can learn from the past in this effort. And to lead us again, I'm grateful to welcome Dr. Thomas Long, Bandy, Professor Emeritus of Preaching at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and author of the book Accompanying Them with Singing, The Christian Funeral. He will introduce our other distinguished panelists in a moment, and about halfway through, we will invite all of you to use the Q&A function, which is located somewhere on your screen, and you can use that to submit any comments and questions. We hope we can get to many of those in the latter part of our time together today. And you can see more details about today's session at our website at ism.yale.edu. And without further ado, let me again welcome Dr. Thomas Long.
Thanks, Martin. I am Tom Long, and I'm privileged to be able to moderate these webinar sessions. Several years ago, when I was doing some field research for the book that Martin mentioned on the Christian funeral, I thought it would be a good idea if I went to at least one place in the United States that had no funeral homes. I wanted to see what the death practices would be for people who didn't have the funeral industry around to contribute their own control and protocols about funerals. That's how I found myself on the Prince of Wales Island off of Alaska, and I was introduced to the Tlingit people. This is an indigenous population on this island. And as a matter of fact, there aren't no funeral homes there. So when someone dies among the Tlingit people, the body home, there is then a community-wide wake that lasts all night. And then in the morning, there's a procession, including a canoe boat ride that takes the body to the burial ground. Interestingly enough, 40 days later, 40 days after the person has died, there is a ceremony of farewell to the spirit of the deceased. I asked them why 40 days, and no one could remember, but they were evangelized by the Russian Orthodox Church about 100 years ago, and I suspect that the Ascension tradition had something to do with this, the 40 days after Easter. But the more I've thought about this practice of a farewell to the spirit of the deceased, the more wisdom I have seen in it. It is the experience of many bereaved people that the sense of the person's presence lingers after the funeral. You hear a song on the radio, or there's the scent of perfume, or you walk into a room where you remember the person and you feel their presence. And in almost all funeral liturgies, there is a strong component of letting the dead go, of saying farewell to them. In the standard Christian service, this is the commendation and the committal. Commend the person to God, commit the body to the earth. In the Jewish liturgy, this is often found in the Jewish prayer of El Malach Amin, which says, let his rest be in the Garden of Eden, cover him in God's wings forever. Let him rest upon his place of repose and peace, and let us all say, Amen. Now, what I also found, but didn't have the chance to explore much, is that in those seasons in history, when this farewell part gets disrupted, sometimes theology changes, sometimes history happens in a way that prevents people from saying farewell. Whenever this happens, culturally speaking, the dead do not go or do not go easily. And they become times of hauntings and ghost sightings and senses of the presence of the lingering dead. COVID has, of course, been one of those times of disruption. We've already talked in this webinar about how many families have been unable to be at bedside when they needed to be and wanted to be as someone they loved died, and how many families have been unable to go to the cemetery or the crematorium to complete the journey of the deceased and to let them go and to say farewell. And sure enough, John Blake, the religion editor at CNN a couple of weeks ago, published an article in which reporting on how the COVID dead have been appearing to their loved ones, that the bereaved have experiences of lights in the sky, or a red bird resting on a windowsill as a sign, or a sighting of a ghost, or a message received, or a touch on the shoulder at bedside. Now, take that as you will. I see these as signs of bereavement. They are also signs that for those of us who care for these families, we need to help people say farewell, whether that's going to be a big All Saints Day in the Christian tradition this year or pastoral care. But we also know this happens historically. After 9/11, there were also many such experiences. After the Indian tsunami, when people were swept away and people could not say farewell, there were ghost sightings and hauntings. After the pandemic of 1918, there was a great rise in spiritualism and the occult and seances and the use of Ouija boards and communication with the dead. We need the cultural rituals of being able to say goodbye to the dead, and history instructs us in this way. That's our theme for today, by the way, is what do we learn from history? We have a long trek dealing with the dead, accompanying the dying in our history. And we've assembled a marvelous panel today of 4 people who are historians and have some special wisdom for us about our previous encounters with such moments as we are experiencing in COVID. Our first presenter is Remi Chu. He's the coordinator of the music program at Loyola University in Baltimore. He's a musicologist and he specializes in Renaissance music and the history of medicine. And he's written a fascinating book called The Plague and Music in the Renaissance. His research into the history of the use of music in times of pandemic has made him something of a media celebrity, talking about music and COVID. He has been on NPR and other places talking about this. Remy, we're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks for having me. Let me share computer here, share screen. All right, so in my work as a musicologist, one of my research concerns is the health consequences of music and sound across history. So I want to spend my lot of time today to bring up a facet of this topic in relation to my research on plague, and to show how that study resonates with some of the ritual practices that I've been observing during COVID. I want to start with a couple of historical documents. The first comes from Pistoia, Italy, and it's a set of civic ordinances that the city put out during the infamous outbreak of the Black Death in 1348. And one of the major concerns that we see in that document is burial services. And the bylaws under that rubric fell broadly within kind of 3 areas. The first was to clamp down on frivolous spending. So no one except a widow was allowed to wear new clothing in the period of mourning. The second area was to mitigate the spread of fetid materials. So graves must be dug at least 2.5 arm's length deep, for example. And finally, there was a limit to the gathering of people. So only spouses and family members were allowed to attend funerals. So these all seem like good common sense provisions. Now, the 10th ordinance, which seemed to stand apart from the rest, really caught my attention as a musicologist. And it reads, in order that the sound of bells does not attack or arouse fear among the sick, the keepers of a cathedral's bell tower shall not allow any of the bells to be rung during funerals under the penalty of 10 denarii. Now, the language here is very important. In order that the sound of bells does not attack or arouse fear amongst the sick. So it's not merely that we don't want to frighten anyone, it's that we don't want to harm or attack anyone. So unpleasant or gloomy sounds, like fetid materials, can be a kind of contagion, can be harmful. Now, a provision like this might seem to us today, next to all of the other practical recommendations, to be like maybe perhaps a kind of inconsequential squeamishness. But in fact, this prohibition of bell ringing was very much informed by science of the time. So under the medical paradigm of the 14th century, so the Hippocratic Galenic model, it was sincerely thought that unpleasant stimuli can profoundly stir the imagination and disrupt the health of the body. I won't go into the mechanisms of this today, but suffice it to say that there was a very strong psychosomatic bond that held together the mind and the body. Now here's a 15th century doctor writing about this in his treatise on the plague. He says that during the plague, avoid public baths, conversations, and associating with many people, for it is a contagious illness striking many. And one man speaking or bathing with another brings about the plague. Right? So far, it's quite legible as maybe even modern medical belief. Then he goes on, for in such times, speaking about the plague is to be avoided, because the imagination alone, and also deep cogitation of fear, brings on the plague bubo. So negative thoughts and bad news about the plague were treated as a kind of contagion itself that can make people succumb to illness. Now, logically, if the sounds of funeral bells and bad news are dangerous, then conversely, pleasant sounds, sensations, and recreations could buttress the mind and body from disease. So in this plague treatise from the 16th century, Dr. Nicomasa prescribes taking walks in the garden, meeting up with friends, and talking of joyful and funny things. And he gives pride of place to music. It is especially advantageous to listen to songs and lovely instrumental music, and to play now and then, and to sing with quiet voice. So what can we take away from this? Well, certainly we no longer operate within the realm of Galenic medicine, so no more humors or spirits and the like, but we are increasingly rediscovering those psychosomatic bonds. So researchers are recognizing that stress has harmful effects on our physical well-being. So during the early days of COVID, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a number of guidelines on the website aimed precisely at dealing with stress. So here's a website, and so CDC advised readers to take breaks from doom scrolling through social media, because reading and hearing about the pandemic repeatedly can be upsetting. Recommended making time for recreation and connecting with friends. So all the things that doctors centuries ago were already recommending. So to bring it to the level of the theme of this webinar, accompanying the dead and the dying and the dead in time of COVID, what does that mean? So for the last year, very much inspired by the Pistoia document, I've been studying the bell ringing rituals during COVID and the kinds of functions that they served. And part of the focus was on the emotional and psychological effects that memorial ringing rituals have had on participants and witnesses. So I have 3 examples today of how ritual performers have handled the emotionalism of their sounds. Now, the first is actually an anti-example. In Italy, in Nembro, one of the early epicenters of COVID, the parish priest actually suspended bell ringing last March for much of the same reasons as we saw in 14th century Pistoia. So one of the priests told reporters, for a whole month now, we've stopped tolling the church bells. Their sound was so psychologically devastating, and they would toll 3, 4, or 5 times a day. They fueled anxiety. So here's an example where church authorities were very mindful of creating a harmful public sonic environment through funerary activities. In other cases, the negative affects associated with bell ringing were intentionally cultivated for different material goals. So for example, on Long Island last fall, Reverend Dwightley Walter recorded the sound of his church bell and played a ring for every life lost in America. And that was 218,000 as of 18th of October, the day he started. So over 2 weeks, Walter tolled his recorded bell at a low volume every 6 seconds, once every 6 seconds, 24 hours a day. Now, while many were supportive of this sobering ceremony, a minority reacted quite negatively with criticisms that really recall the Pistoian's worries. So an owner of a nearby business complained that, while I love the sentiment behind it, I wouldn't be surprised that the constant noise will exacerbate my anxiety/PTSD. Another wrote, it's very inconsiderate to residents, especially those with babies, those who are sick, the elderly, etc. Now, it's important to point out here that A, these complaints were all preemptive. They came before the ceremony even began. And B, the recording was at such a low volume that the reactions were really more directed at the imaginary symbolism of it than any actual acoustic disturbance. But nevertheless, that frightful symbolism was there, and it was really intended to be provocative. So while in the first instance, this was meant to be a memorial for COVID deaths, in the framing of the ritual, in the social media announcements and in the TV interviews, the Reverend also wanted to use the tolling, that sonic bombardment, to remind the community to take health precautions. Now, my last example is another ceremony that also leveraged negative emotions and the imagination for a material goal. So after the killing of George Floyd, many churches across the US tolled their bells for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to represent the amount of time that Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck. And the participants were meant to experience that duration of time during which Floyd was deprived of breath and to imagine his suffering. So in Reverend Evanson's appeal for the commemoration, he asked participants to pause and listen to the bells, remembering George Floyd's now famous last words, "Please, I can't breathe." And those are words that certainly had special significance during COVID. So while the rituals for Floyd homed in on a tragedy not directly related to the pandemic, they were inevitably experienced as part of the greater health crisis. And that symbolism, that I can't breathe symbolism, really tied him to the broader dialogues about racial inequalities and disease. So Rashid Shabazz, that you see there, is just one of the many writers to have pointed out that fighting for air is nothing new for Black people, metaphorically because they're denied freedom and justice, and literally because they're dying of COVID at higher rates. And you can see many other examples where there's a metaphorical mapping of systemic racism with the COVID pandemic. So what these 846 ring rituals did was to encourage participants to imagine Floyd's suffering and suffocation. And the participants can do so not only by recalling the actual event, but also through that metaphorical mapping by imagining or perhaps even personally recalling the pulmonary symptoms of COVID that were described ubiquitously in the media. So that racism as pandemic metaphor at the discursive level via this ritual became embodied and personally felt as something that's deadly and urgent. So these three cases represent very different examples of how ritual performers have contended with the emotional consequences of bell ringing. So from curtailing it outright to mobilizing it to galvanize a community to action. So by way of wrapping up, I want to come back to the theme of this panel, looking to history for insights. For me, my historical work has really taught me to attune to the consequences of sound, both as an acoustical phenomenon and in their functions as symbols that can motivate certain emotions, as well as ways of thinking and behaving. I will admit that I don't think I would have taken seriously those complaints about bell ringing exacerbating PTSD if it were not for my historical perspective on the importance of controlling the soundscape in times of crises. So without being too prescriptive about it, I hope that in some small way that analyses like these can help us to be more mindful about the unpredictable multivalence of sound, and be aware of how to use it strategically and purposefully in times, especially in times of volatility and crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Remy. Maybe you can turn off your share screen. That's good. So we'll be back to our regular setting. Fascinating connections there. I was trying to think about what bell ringing do I have in my environment about the COVID-19, and I don't have actual church bells or town bells ringing, but my weather app gives me the number of deaths in my county every day. And those bells keep reminding me of the encroaching illness. And also the interesting way that you tied one pandemic, namely the coronavirus, to another pandemic of racism, how they interact with each other. We'll have a lot to talk about when we get into some cross conversation about that. And let me remind those of you who are participating that you do have the Q&A button there. And if an issue comes along that you'd like to pursue, ask a question about, or to make a contribution, please use that, and we'll get to as many of you as we can. Our next panelist is Vanessa Harding, and she's a professor of history, professor of the history of London, really, at Birkbeck University. It's a part of the University of London system. And her research focuses on medieval and early modern London history, including health and disease, plague, death, and burial in the history of London. Vanessa, we're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. I'll start by sharing my screen and then I'll go ahead. Okay, I hope we're there. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak. My historical approach is slightly different from Remy's. I'm particularly interested in institutions, in organizations, and in how people respond in times of crisis. And I've been very interested in burial in London because how people deal with the dead, both in everyday situations and in epidemics, seems to me to tell us a lot about London and London society. So I'm jumping forward some 3 centuries from the Black Death of 1348 to 9 and focusing on one of many plagues that struck London, the one that struck in 1665. So after the Black Death, which swept across Europe, plague epidemics became more localized, more urban, rather than nationwide events, but plague itself never went away. And the 1665 epidemic is known to posterity as the Great Plague, not because it was more severe than other epidemics, but because London was larger, so more people died. And also, I think, because it was the last such outbreak. The last plague is always the Great Plague. And it's also the best documented event, thanks to the survival of lots of different kinds of writing and archaeological records. I think we find that people at this time are speaking in voices that we can recognize. So this 1665 epidemic is typical of the time in that it came and went more or less within a year. Plague had been present in the Netherlands, which was one of Britain's key trading partners in 1664, but there are very few infections or deaths in London before about April 1665. But once it took hold, Londoners watched in horror as plague mortality mounted rapidly over the summer, from tens to scores to hundreds to thousands of deaths every week. It spread right across London and its suburbs, and then the epidemic slowly subsided in the late autumn and winter. But by the end of 1665, over 70,000 people had died of plague in London and its suburbs. That's about a fifth of the city's total population. So how did people respond to this? And I think the first point to say is that they were quite well prepared because they had experienced plague before. So London's governors knew what to do and how they should do it. The Lord Mayor and Aldermen, who were the rulers of the City of London, had a script or a set of regulations known as the Plague Orders, which had been drawn up in earlier epidemics and which covered things like the closure of theatres, the closure of schools, the regulation of inns and taverns, street cleaning, the management of burial, measures to control potential disorder, including a curfew. Some of these, of course, are now familiar to us. The city employed physicians and it ran a pest house or a plague hospital, though this actually took in only a small minority of the sick. And there was a sophisticated system for collecting and publishing weekly death totals known as the Bills of Mortality. And I think the second point is the importance of local connections and organisation in the response. The plague orders drew on existing infrastructure, and each of London's 130 parishes was responsible for enforcing the plague orders, specifically for imposing quarantine on infected households and for supporting the poor and sick financially. And as this slide shows, the actual cost of that was really quite substantial. And parishes were also primarily responsible for burying the dead, their dead parishioners. And it's interesting and striking how long people adhered to traditional practices of burial before they were overwhelmed by the large numbers to be dealt with. It was obviously very important to Londoners that they should be able to continue doing what they had done in the past. If we look at the church's response, like that of the city government, it's based on past experience, on existing personnel and institutions, though I think one has to say the picture is complicated by the variety of beliefs and practices in 1660s London. But having said that, I would say there is a common thread to their reactions, which is based on a providential worldview, the sense that the epidemic was a judgment, a trial, that as well as practical actions and medical remedies, prayer and repentance were required. Fast days were mandated, many plague-related sermons were given. Although public assemblies were largely banned, including large gatherings at funerals, church attendance seems to have remained quite high. Indeed, it was probably higher during the epidemic than it was at other times. And sermons and fasts continued as outward manifestations of the response, the spiritual response to plague, even as the epidemic abated and services of thanksgiving for deliverance were issued. Now, after the plague was over, stories circulated that of clergy who had fled London, who had abandoned their flocks. But I think it's actually quite hard to measure this in practice. And the stories probably owe something to the rivalry between different faith groups. And certainly many ministers and priests died in the epidemic. And where we have letters or diaries, we can see men conscientiously tending to their congregations. The Anglican minister Simon Patrick of St. Paul's Covent Garden, a church that still stands, remained at his post, despite pleas from his friends to save himself by leaving London. His attitude was calm and pragmatic. He wrote, "Somebody must be here, and is it fit that I should set such a value upon myself as my going away and leaving another will signify? For that would be in effect to say that I am too good to be lost, but it's no matter if another be." He was quite sympathetic to his friends who were begging him to leave London, and he tried to reassure them that he would be all right. But he said that he wasn't staying in London to accomplish a martyrdom, as you call it, that's too high a name, but to do a little service to my neighbours, who I think would not be so well if I was not here. "I cannot well stir from hence," he wrote, "for to tell you the truth, there is nobody to perform any duties here but myself only. So he stayed in London throughout the epidemic. I'm glad to say that he did survive and indeed went on to have a distinguished career in the church. His main duties, and of course those of his colleagues, were to lead church services and prayers and to bury his parishioners with the rites of the church in the parish churchyard, wherever that was possible. At the height of the epidemic, there were up to 30 deaths a week in his small parish. One night, he reported that he'd conducted 6 burials. And most of the time, I think it's unlikely that ministers were able to visit their dying parishioners, given the quarantine regulations, though some at least wrote or witnessed wills for people on their deathbeds. In larger parishes, where hundreds died every week, the clergy must have been much more stretched and stressed. An orderly burial of the dead was at breaking point by the late summer. By this time, the city has to open a large new burial ground in the suburbs to cope with the overflowing numbers. What I find is very interesting is that when personal pastoral care is somewhat interrupted, the clergy and others turned to print, turned to the social media of the time in order to communicate with their parishioners. So there's an outpouring of publications that address the spiritual needs and concerns of Londoners. Simon Patrick published at least 3 such pamphlets, which he dedicated to his parishioners. Other ministers and pastors published sermons, prayers, consolatory discourses. They seized on all available media to reach those in need of their support. There was evidently also demand for a range of cheap commercial publications and a marketing opportunity for remedies and medicaments. So commemorative broadsides brought out by a number of independent printers combined text, image, and statistics. So they reminded Londoners of other historic or more recent plagues, perhaps in the same sort of way that we're now thinking about what can we learn from history. They offered remedies. They very commonly offered prayers. They provided people with figures of local mortality and gaps in which they could fill in the information as it came in. The image on the right with the large cross on it is something that was published in September, but the person who bought it then went on adding information right through the rest of the year and into 1666. Medical practitioners of all kinds published handbills, pamphlets, offering a mixture of advice, recipes, and remedies, advertisements for proprietary medicine. And the popularity of these tracts indicates a real appetite for information, but there's no consistency of approach. Londoners embraced a variety of medical theories. I mean, humoral theory, humoral medicine was still very popular, but there was also more modern chemical medicine, sympathetic, and astrological medicine. But it's interesting again that most medical publications paid at least lip service to the ideas of providence and judgment as first causes, with medical intervention as something supplementary. And I think all of these help us to understand it's important to understand the mindsets and the preconceptions of people of the time in order to evaluate the effectiveness of their response. I can't say in terms of effectiveness that anybody was cured of plague by these individual remedies, but no doubt there was important comfort, reassurance, consolation to be got from a sense of having the information that you needed. So when we come to thinking about what lessons we can draw from this, as a historian, I would tend to say that the lessons we draw from the past are essentially those that we want to hear, those that confirm our views and beliefs, or at least that answer questions that we think are important. So for me, the striking feature of the 1665 epidemic, I think, is the importance of strong social bonds, the acknowledgement of obligation to others, whether this was expressed in obedience to regulation or commitment to an office or professional duty. The visibility of officials and clergy made an important contribution to this. The sense of shared tribulation was fostered by the rapid circulation of information in words and print. The impact of plague was certainly the heaviest on the poorest and the most vulnerable, but compassion and charity were not lacking. Of course, there were exceptions to this solidarity. There were outbreaks of disorder or of desperation. The flight of the well-to-do to their country retreats was strongly criticised at the time, though it was somewhat excused if they continued to make financial contributions to their London neighbours' welfare. So what I find striking and important, and the message I take away from London's experience in 1665, is how well social bonds survived this severe attack, how strong those in fact were, and that it's the locality and the neighbourhood and the knowledge of one's neighbours that seems to have been one of the strongest threads that carried Londoners through.
I think you're muted, Tom.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Vanessa. When we talk a little bit later, I want to explore that issue you raised of the power of strong social bonds, because I think that's one of the things that's probably in peril in our current society about death practices, and in need of some attention and repair, perhaps. We'll talk about that later. Right now, we want to hear from Markus Rathey, who is a professor in the practice of music theology at Yale. His focus is on 17th, 18th, and early 19th century music, especially Johann Sebastian Bach. And he's really interested in the interconnections of music, religion, and culture of the Enlightenment. And he's written some fascinating things about the role of music and ars moriendi, which is the art of dying in the 17th century. Markus, we're glad you're here with us.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. Historically, we'll stay in the same period that Vanessa has just talked about, but we'll move from England to Germany. In the early 1680s, so a few years after the epidemic in London, we have an outbreak of the plague in central Germany. And between 1681 and 1683, some areas lost about half of their population. The city of Erfurt alone, for instance, lost 57% of its citizens, and these numbers are very similar in other areas. When we look at this historical period and look at ways how the dying were accompanied, we have to take into account that caring for the dying means also caring for the living as well. It means consoling the ones who have lost loved ones. And it also means to make sense of the current situation. Why is there a plague? Why are people dying? And historical sources from this period very often try to navigate the tensions between a theological answer to this question and scientific answer. And we see that authors very often try to keep a balance between these two poles. One example that I want to show is Matthias Ramelow's Kurzer Auszug und Unterricht, published in Braunschweig, a northern German city, in 1681, so directly during this epidemic. The small book describes for the non-professional reader the best ways to protect yourself from the plague and how to heal it. And the chapters in Ramelow's book provide some good recipes and some that are rather superstitious, very similar to what Vanessa has just described for London. But the underlying concept for the whole book is, I think, still noteworthy. At the beginning of his treatise, the author recounts the story of a pastor who had survived the epidemic with two types of protection. Psalm 91, who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, and by taking wine with some vermouth against the bad fumes which allegedly caused the plague. So regardless of this rather spurious remedy, I think what's important for this approach is that the book tries to show that there is a combination of two ways of countering the plague: faith on the one hand and science on the other hand. The trust in medical remedies on the one hand and the trust in prayer on the other hand. We find a similar approach in a book by Adam von Lebenswald, Stadt, Land und Hausarzneibuch, published in 1695, but really reflecting some of the developments during the plague earlier that century. And the book is a very extensive treatise and targets all kinds of professionals. And there is one chapter for the clergy, the Status Theologicus. And von Lebenswald describes how clergy can be good shepherds by staying with their congregations in the times of the plague. So it is very clearly reacting to clergy that try to leave their towns and villages to escape from the plague. And Lebenswald points out that the good shepherd would stay with their flock. But he's also very realistic in the way how he elaborates on his guidelines. For instance, he points out that the clergy should always take care of the sick without endangering the rest of the congregation. And one of the most familiar advices that is given by this book is what we have been doing for more than a year: social distancing. And he describes, for instance, how confessions could be possible in a time when the priest and the the congregation member could not be very close. He describes how many feet apart these two persons should be, and the whole thing should happen outside in order not to get infected with the plague. He also suggests that all rituals around death and dying should be questions whether they are really necessary. They should be reevaluated whether the ritual is necessary, or whether, like in the case of the last confession, if the person who is dying does not feel that they need to confess, von Lebenswald suggests that a confession is not necessary. So his approach is it dangerous to fulfill a certain ritual? And if so, and if it's not necessary to go through with it. Von Lebenswald also writes about music, which of course for me as a music historian is particularly interesting. And in several cases, he advises against secular music and against dancing. This is not so much the rejection of secular music, but a rejection of the fact that people come together to dance and to listen to music. And of course, in times of social distancing, this causes a problem. However, what is allowed is sacred music, and especially music for devotional purposes at home. And we see that reflected in a number of hymnals that were published in the late 17th century. Here, for instance, is a page from a Leipzig hymnal, Geistliches Brand- und Ganzopfer, published in 1697, which included special rubrics for the times of the plague. Earlier editions of this hymnal already included sections for accompanying the dying, for times of sickness, but now in the late 17th century, we have a specific rubric that includes hymns for the times of death. So these hymnals very clearly react to a spiritual need that arose at the end of the 17th century. The Leipzig hymnal, Leipzig organist Daniel Vetter publishes in the early 18th century a book with hymns for domestic use. And he writes, it is necessary to add the songs about death because experience has taught us that when an edifying way, the thoughts of death written down by faithful hearts can be presented. So the hymnal cannot do without these songs because this is the way how we can edify the congregation, how we can inspire them? How can we can console them? A few years after the end of the pandemic in the early 1680s, Leipzig pastor Johann Benedict Karpzow published a hymn sermon in which he explains the power of hymnody. And he writes, in the same way as we are patient in distress, we have to endure now, we can be joyful and full of hope, expecting the future glory as Paul admonishes us. Even though the words patient and joyful, he's referring to a specific hymn, might be small, they are also very powerful. It is as if a medicus wants to heal a melancholicus who understands music. He teaches him to sing first slowly and then faster, and this way God's power will cure him. In the same way, the words in the hymn will drive out the spirit of distress and lift us up. If we take these two elements together, we see that both the text of a hymn and also the music of a hymn can drive away the spirit of distress, and therefore can be powerful, can be a powerful tool, both for the dying, but also for loved ones who stay behind. I would like to close with two practical examples from the plague in 1681 to 1683. Not only congregants longed for consolation in the times of the plague, but composers also lost loved ones and suffered from the epidemic. Music for them was consolation and a way to console others. In 1681, the organist in Mühlhausen in central Germany, Johann Georg Ahle, lost his mother and one of his siblings to the plague. And Ahle published a collection of 3 songs. He wrote the texts himself and also wrote the music. And we can see in the text how he struggles with the theological and spiritual significance of these events. It is clear to him that the plague is a punishment for human sins, one of the prevailing ideas about the reasons for the plague. But he also knows that it's not necessarily the sin of the individual who dies, but more the sins of humanity in general. And he integrates his reflections about this theological idea into a larger context of salvation history by writing 3 songs, each of them directed to one person of the Trinity. The punishment for the committed sins is reflected in the hymn to God the Father, and Ahle ponders that humanity would have deserved an even harsher punishment than the plague. In the second hymn, then, he calls on the love of Christ, the Redeemer. Christ appears as intercessor and is asking God for mercy and forgiveness. And finally, the Holy Spirit in the third song is the sweet consoler, as one of the lines states. The Spirit consoles those who have suffered and is also called on washing humanity from its sins so that a punishment won't be necessary in the future. By invoking the triune God, Ahle can maintain the idea of the plague as divine punishment, but at the same time provide a perspective of both consolation and hope. The melodies that accompany the texts are very simple and can be sung as 4-part settings in a small group, but also as solo songs with the accompaniment of a keyboard instrument. In both cases, the target group is the home. It's not music for the church. It is sacred music, but not church music. So it is music for domestic devotion. People coming together, singing for the dying, and in order to console them. So the music itself is intended to lift the spirit and to console, to project harmony in a world that has gone out of order. The second example is a collection of keyboard chorales composed in reaction to the same plague, composed by Johann Pachelbe, famous for his canon today, but in his own time, he was an accomplished teacher and keyboard composer. Pachelbe had lost his wife and his child in the epidemic during the year of 1682-1683. And he composed a collection of variations of funeral hymns and published them in print in 1683, Musikalische Sterbensgedanken, musical thoughts about death. And the collection combines two elements: the importance of hymns for the consolation of the living and for accompanying the dying, and music as part of domestic piety. The four hymns that Pachelbe has chosen are Ach, was soll ich Sünder machen? Ah, what shall I do? Sinner that I am. Werde munter mein Gemüte, wake up my spirit. Alle Menschen müssen sterben, all humans must die. And what God tut, das ist wohlgetan. What God does is all done well. So four funeral hymns that reflect on death and dying from very different perspectives. But he's not only selecting the hymns, but he's also turning these hymns into chorale variations. So music that can be played for meditation and also for entertainment. And he makes these hymns part of domestic piety. Pachelbe's hymns are not music for the organ, not for the church. They are for keyboard instruments. So it can be played on harpsichord, clavichord, or on a small house organ. So they are music for domestic meditation on death and dying. And by playing the melodies and by going through the different variations, the player as well as the listener had time to meditate on the texts of the hymns, on their spiritual significance, but also on their own mortality and the preparedness for their own death. So music here, playing keyboard music, becomes part of a spiritual practice. Alan Pachelbe not only composed their reactions to Pachelbe not only composed their reactions to personal grief, but also put their music into print. The compositions grew out of a personal situation, but they address a larger issue. Music becomes a way to cope with grief. The composers channel their own grief into the compositions, but they also provide others with a way of dealing with the same grief. The songs and keyboard pieces provide reflections on death and dying for a domestic context, for the families of those who have lost loved ones, but also for houses where a family member was still at the threshold between life and death. And the pieces don't provide easy answers. They struggle with theological problems. We hear hope, fear, the notion of sinfulness, but also of Christ's mercy. But what is clear is that both Ahle and Pachelbe saw an answer in the question, how do I deal with death, dying, and the epidemic in music, in culture, in composing new compositions to accompany the dying and also console the living. Thank you.
Thank you, Markus. One of the themes that has run like a ribbon through all of the webinars so far is that music is an underutilized resource for us. And I appreciated very much your lifting up not only the consolation of music, but also the theological edification and instruction of music, music as sermon, as well as music as consolation. Thank you for that. Our last panelist is James Starke. He's the director of the Office of Divine Worship for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, and he's a lecturer at Catholic University of America. James is trained as a scientist as well as a philosopher and a theologian, and he's written on the history of the Roman Catholic Mass, but he's also written on creation and evolution and creation and Big Bang theory. James, we're glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the staff of the Yale Institute of Sacred Music for the invitation to discuss the 1918 pandemic today, how church leaders responded to it, and what practical lessons we might adopt. And I am taking this topic up from my own perspective as a Roman Catholic, though mindful that the examples I'll draw from today find parallels in many other traditions as well. So from the 1890s to the early 1900s, a series of flu epidemics had swept across the globe. But at the end of World War I, a particularly devastating strand of the H1N1 flu began to spread. Waves rippled first across Europe, though this common title of the Spanish flu is likely a misnomer. It landed on other shores, and this H1N1 flu of the early 1900s was clearly distinct from other viruses of the time. Compared to the seasonal flu, it resulted in 25 times the numbers of death. And whereas the seasonal flu largely caused death among infants and the elderly, the 1918 variant was also deadly for 20 to 35-year-olds. Fear during the pandemic of 1918 was only heightened by the unknown cause of the illness. The now common understanding that illnesses can be caused by germs was still relatively new in the early 20th century. And flu-causing viruses and their vaccines would not be identified for another decade and a half. Therefore, civil leaders at the time responded to this uncertainty as best they could. Some of these sound familiar. They imposed mask mandates, had social distancing requirements, put limitations on gatherings. Businesses were temporarily shuttered, and athletes played in empty stadiums. In the religious sphere, the civil restrictions led to the closing of churches, and limits were imposed on ministry to the sick and on funerals, including their prohibition at times. In many places, funerals went uncelebrated also because the dead were buried within just hours after death for fear of transmitting the infection to those still living. Desperate measures unfolded for the treatment of bodies because morgues and cemeteries were simply overwhelmed, and there were no materials to make coffins. Mass graves were not uncommon. Therefore, during the 1918 pandemic, church leaders faced clear challenges in accompanying the dying and the dead. And they responded with a diversity not unlike what we have observed these past 15 months. On the one hand, science journalist Laura Spiney relates how Bishop of Zamora, Spain, Bishop Alvaro y Boyano, openly defied the civil restrictions. He held large masses, processions, and devotional gatherings to combat the pandemic with prayer, invoke God's protection, and to appease divine judgment. After the fact, historians would find that the city of Zamora suffered severely, with double the death rates as compared to other cities in Spain. On the other hand, Dr. Jeff Kildeo relates how in Sydney, Australia, Archbishop Michael Kelly expressed strong support for civil measures. However, even here in Sydney, religious support would wane as restrictions became more severe and inconsistent. For example, by allowing bars to stay open while placing limitations on churches. In one incident that Kildea describes, a priest was denied access to celebrate last rites for the dying. And when Archbishop Kelly himself attempted to gain access, he too was denied. Upon appeal, the government eventually granted permission, but only under strict conditions. Church leadership during the 1918 pandemic also exhibited creativity and flexibility. Clergy encouraged all members of the community to care for the dying and the dead. As Christina Stetler describes, Archbishop D.J. Doherty of Philadelphia, one of the hardest hit cities in the US, released religious sisters from their usual duties so that they could serve as volunteer nurses. The Archbishop also opened up churches and their properties for use as hospitals. In caring for the dead, funeral rites, when they could be celebrated, were impacted. A single ceremony could be celebrated for several deceased at once, yet in the presence of only a few close relatives, if any at all. Customary funeral processions through the streets, which emphasize the communal nature of mourning and remembering the dead, were omitted. The ringing of bells at the time of funerals were also omitted. Special effort had to be made to bury the dead. And historian Nancy Bristow describes how students at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary carried out this work of mercy by digging graves with steam shovels. As the various waves of the pandemic receded, Catholic priests celebrated Requiem masses for those who had died, thus preserving some sense of the communal remembrance and mourning of the dead. Even so, prominent historians of the 1918 pandemic generally agree on this, that the collective public memory and mourning of the dead failed in the 1920s and beyond. In her book, American Pandemic, written even before the coronavirus, Nancy Bristow invites us to learn an important lesson: that we cannot allow a 21st century pandemic to be forgotten by the community. For those of us in this webinar, that concern is informed by history, but it's also pastoral and theological. We carry out works of mercy for the dying and dead as members of the ecclesia, the community called out by God. It's in this ecclesial context that we accompany those who grieve, whose original mourning was frustrated because of restrictions on the rites that accompany the dying and commend the dead to God. It is as the people of God that we are called to comfort those who may have enduring side effects or trauma, whether from an infection that took one near the point of death or experiences of helplessness in caring for the dying. In other words, what we learned from the 1918 pandemic is that we are called to remember, to mourn, and to hope as a community. In my view, we'll need many ways of manifesting this. In my own Catholic tradition, it will be essential to complete the rites of final commendation and committal where necessary, as well as to celebrate memorial masses and observe with care the commemoration of All Souls on November 2nd. In my tradition, we also have an official communal rite for visiting cemeteries at the time a gravestone is placed, on the anniversary of death or burial. And what's important here is that deacons and lay ministers can lead that ritual, which would help relieve some of the burden placed on priests. At the same time, we can see from the 1918 pandemic, at least the mourning that took place at the time, even if it failed after, is that our official liturgies need not be the exclusive expression. In the past few decades, communities, our own communities, have engaged in powerful expressions of remembrance, mourning, and hope in the face of death, especially tragic death. In my mind, are services like the Requiem for the Black Children of God, celebrated by Archbishop Gregory Amond of New Orleans and adopted by other US dioceses. That ceremony included a public procession through the city and the reading of names, each accompanied by the solemn intoning of a bell, providing a balance between personal grief and communal mourning. Non-ritual forms of expression can also be valuable. Professor Elizabeth Utka has discerned how the 1918 pandemic influenced such artworks as T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and W.B. Yeats's The Second Coming. Nancy Bristow points to the impacts of the pandemic on wider areas of art, such as music. So today, the performance of established works of art, but also the creation of new artwork, intentionally drawn from our pandemic experience, can be a significant contribution. So while vaccines and other measures have us hastening toward a new normal, we are cautioned by history not to neglect this important time of communal remembrance, mourning, and hope. We are part of an ecclesial community. Our members have suffered and died from pandemics, some of whom we now call saints. Saints Jacinta and Francisco Marto died of influenza in 1919 and 1920. Some of those members continue to suffer. As we look to the distant and the not so distant past at how the church has responded in times of pandemic, we remember that we are God's people who together sing our prayer, O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. Be thou our guide while troubles last, and our eternal home. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And these have been rich presentations. And I want to pick up on what you were talking about at the end, James, and Vanessa also underlined, but it was present in all of the presentations, and that's the social and communal dimension of this, the social fabric, the social structures for grieving and addressing the pandemic. Let me raise it from two perspectives. Within the memory of some of us, there was a time when someone died, the body would be placed on the table, the family table, and the women would wash and dress the body. The men folk would dig a grave and build a coffin. The neighbors would bring food over and would visit during the time of grieving and preparing for the funeral. And then the whole community would walk to the grave with the family for the service. In other words, everybody in society had a job and knew what to do. And one of our challenges is that people don't exactly know what to do now. The social jobs, the vocations of ordinary people around death have been taken over by the funeral director or disappeared into suburban life. There's that challenge. Our questioners are also concerned about the breakdown of social structures caused by the politicization of our life. Whether you take a vaccine or not is now not a social decision, but a political one. Whether you trust science or not becomes a political issue. What about restoring or nurturing the social fabric? What can any of you say in response to that?
Well, I can jump in. One of the, the social fabric piece is a much broader thing than a historian like me can deal with. But I think one of the things that we'd be very careful about is projecting certain narratives onto COVID that might have unintentional consequences. So there was, going back to bell ringing, there was a Bells Across Pennsylvania Day last year, where the proclamation said, as we have done since the American Revolution, we'll ring our bells to galvanize our community, to bring people together. But of course, those kinds of metaphors can be easily misinterpreted, are very dangerous. So on one hand, even military metaphors are problematic, but to invoke the idea of freedom under the guise of patriotism exacerbates a lot of the problems out there, right? So people are championing freedom, but for their faces. So freedom from masks. It's in our Constitution that we have to be free. So in the way we structure our ceremonies, I think we have to be very careful about those kinds of messages and narratives.
Thoughts from others?
Can I perhaps just, this is really asking Markus a question about the societies he was talking about. The London that I was describing is a city that has recently undergone serious civil war. major disruption to political structures and indeed to the ways in which people worshipped. And it's the center of, it's in the middle of a half a century of serious political instability. And yet it still seems to me quite striking that public order doesn't break down. That despite the differences that there have been, and despite fears of seditious republicanism, or indeed of Catholicism, which is associated with hostile continental powers, is that there isn't in fact a breakdown of public order, and there is, on the whole, a general adherence to these rules. And I wanted to ask Markus about the German societies that he's talking about. I mean, are they also overcoming these histories of division and conflict in these sorts of ways?
Most definitely. Germany had not gone through a civil war in the English way, but of course, Germany had lived through the 30 Years' War, which had just ended in 1648, and now in the early 1680s, we are dealing with this plague. So it's an interesting situation, because on the one hand, modes of grieving, modes of reflecting death and dying from the time of the 30 Years' War are being revived, because the reason for death was different, but of course the devotional and spiritual responses are very similar. On a political level, however, the 30 Years' War had led to essentially consolidation of the political arena in Germany. It was very clear that the territory you lived in, the denomination you had to follow, and so this political consolidation at the end of the 30 Years' War definitely helped to keep the order during the time of the plague. So it might have looked different, both theologically and also politically, if the 30 Years' War hadn't happened and the German territories had faced the plague without that preparation. But of course, I mean, that's speculation.
Markus, one of the things that you raised, but also was touched on by others, is the theological reflection that was done via music and other forms, sermons and other forms. And you get the sense today that for many in the church, theology is kind of the third rail when it comes to COVID. You don't really want to talk about the theology of the pandemic, lest it venture over into something God is doing to punish us or judge us, or so that there's a kind of a silence, this sort of medical language, but there's not much in terms of theological language. Looking back at our previous experiences with pandemic, how important is this theological reflection, singing, sermonizing? Any of you?
I think it's essential, because that is the way how you can cope with a situation. And we see that very clearly, that in the 17th century, even though we have this idea that the plague is divine punishment for human sins, which is a theological notion most of us would probably not subscribe to, but the idea of consolation, the idea of Christ as intercessor and asking God to end this pandemic, the Holy Spirit as the consoler and the one who's washing us clean. All of these theological ideas, I think, are still very, very helpful in our own time. There is another element I haven't mentioned, but I think it's theologically very important. The book by Adam von Lebenswald, the man who writes about how clergy should behave. One statement that really stood out for me was that he essentially declared the lack of social distancing as sin. He says, if you don't socially distance, and if you don't take care of your neighbor, if you don't take care that you don't infect your neighbor, you're committing a sin. And I think that's a pretty stark comment theologically, even in our time.
Interesting, yeah. Well, there's so much more I want to ask you, but we're running out of time here. I wanted to ask you about the, in a pandemic, we not only tenderly care for the dead, we're afraid of them. They become a threat to us. And the rural cemetery movement in America was because the dead were a threat. They exuded, it was thought, a gas called miasma that made healthy people sick. And so we moved the cemeteries out of the cities and into the open air of the rural areas. But we don't have time to talk about that, but we can think about it given all that you've given us. Martin,
you just froze there for a minute, Tom, but I'll take that as my invitation to wrap up here. First, again, just to say, panelists, how grateful I am for all of your participation today. Not only have you shed light on our current moment, but whether you know it or not, you've just proved the great value of the humanities. And for those that have ears, let them hear. I hope that we can all learn lessons from our humanistic disciplines as time goes on. Two things just to note for our auditors today, that recordings of these sessions are slowly being mounted on the ISM website. Again, ism.yale.edu. You can find them under the sub-menu Initiatives, and you'll see in the left-hand bar there a link to this set of webinar. Just drill down on that, and the first one is up already, and the second will soon be up, and this one to follow as well. And then secondly, to encourage you all again to join us for the fourth and final installment of our webinar, which will be this coming Thursday, July 1st at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, if you're attending this session, you've already registered for the entire series. You don't need to register again. You'll be sent a link the day before and 1 hour before as a reminder to tune in and where to tune in. And I hope you will, as we conclude this long and sweeping exploration of caring for the dying and the dead in a time of COVID. Thank you to all of our presenters again, and everyone. Hope to see you this coming Thursday. Bye-bye.